Yesterday I showed you a couple of games from the match between Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen. Really dramatic stuff. Honours were even after day one. So they went into day two and Hikaru Nakamura won the first game, and I'm going to show you what happened in the second game of the second set. And once more, there were thrills and spills all the way through this match. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. And do consider supporting us via PayPal or Patreon. Check out the rewards on Patreon. You can see my video on the channel opening page. Right, here we go. So Nakamura won the first game of this second set convincingly. And now he had the white pieces. And he played bishop b5 check. Well, maybe that's already an indication that he wants to play something relatively straightforward, relatively solid. Certainly if Carlsen plays bishop d7, I'm sure Nakamura would have been delighted just to exchange pieces. But of course Carlsen needed to play for a win and played knight d7. Now bishop a4 played very quickly. Looks a bit bizarre. Of course it's preempting a6. Basically Nakamura wants to preserve that bishop, and in some positions he's going to play c3 to bring that bishop back, and in some positions he's going to play c4. Knight f6, standard developing move, hits the pawn, but Nakamura just castles. If that pawn is taken, then white gets a tremendous initiative. That's a very well-known position. So a6. So that basically now forces white to make a decision with this pawn. Does it go to c3 or c4? c4 played, stopping b5. e6, knight c3. And now basically both players have decided that they want to go for this so-called hedgehog position. So after this exchange you can see black has these pawns on the 6th rank which shut out white's pieces. So it's a really strong defensive shell, and white has this so-called Marozzi bind, but it's hard for white to actually make a breakthrough because black's position is resilient. Queen e2. But it's a slightly unusual hedgehog position because of the position of the bishop on a4. Normally you could say it might be on e2, maybe d3, sometimes even on g2. But a4 is certainly unusual. Queen c7. Bishop b3, okay. Really sort of bizarre, but actually there's a reason for this. If white doesn't play this, then it's quite possible that black is going to play knight c5 and attack this pawn anyway, and you certainly wouldn't want to play b3 under those circumstances. So that's why the bishop comes back and kind of preempts that attack. So it means if knight e5, then there is the potential just to push the knight away with f4. So b6, the standard setup for black. The bishop comes to the long diagonal, this pawn is attacked, and that's solidly protected. Rook c8, rook c1, and rook e8. So these are the normal positions for the rooks. The rook opposite the queen, and although the e-file is closed, of course, it's incredible how often the position of the rook can make itself felt after a d5 break. Rook d1, well, but at the moment certainly no d5 break is happening when the rook stands opposite the queen. So queen b8. So absolutely standard play so far for the hedgehog. The queen dips back, steps out of the c-file. Only piece which is slightly weirdly placed is that bishop. And now, after 3 minutes thought, Nakamura bounced it up to a4. Good idea. that is awkward for the rook. So Carlsen had a decision to make, and he played rook to c7. b4, so this was one of the ideas of moving the bishop out. And now rook ec8. So this was the idea of rook c7. He just wanted to make room for the rook, and now he's stepped away from this pin. So the rook's double on the c-file, and as there's a pawn on c4 which now needs protecting, and behind it an unprotected knight on c3. I say unprotected, it's protected by the rook, but there are two rooks there. Now, some interesting tactical possibilities arise because of that. So first of all, bishop b3 defends that. And here Carlsen invested just over 4 minutes and decided now was the moment to break out. I mean, black can just sit there. You could wait, but he wasn't in a waiting mood. He really wanted to heap the pressure on Nakamura. You could play a move like knight e5 to hit here. But knight a4 is actually quite annoying. Hitting b6. Like that. And then white can kind of consolidate on the queen side. That's now a reasonably strong setup. Just defending that pawn. Not so easy for black to break out then. So Carlsen here decided he didn't want to wait. Played an incredibly risky move. Pawn to b5. Now this is a pretty standard break in the hedgehog. If you can get it in, it's usually a really good idea. You're chipping away at white's centre. And here, obviously, pawn takes pawn will be met by rook takes c3. So he's using the double rooks on the c-file. So why is this such a risky move? Well, because white has a very obvious piece sacrifice. So white has 2 pawns for the piece, plus, in all likelihood, you're going to get a rook back. So it'll be 2 minor pieces for a rook and 2 pawns. Just a really double-edged position. So yes, if the rook moves up, here for example, then knight a7. So Carlsen can't avoid that. And his next move I really like. I'm not saying the position is wonderful for black. I think white is objectively doing pretty well. But this kind of move I really like in the hedgehog. It's a real randomizer. So it's useful in that you give the king an escape square. When the position breaks open even more, that's handy to have. But also you're just going to punt this h-pawn down the board and see how far it gets. Okay, what's white doing? Well, Nakamura decided now is the time to launch the a-pawn. Just get these pawns rolling down the board. Fair enough. You could take here. But after this, now it's 2 pawns for the piece. I mean, white isn't necessarily worse there, but anyway, not the kind of thing Nakamura wants. He doesn't want a definitely worse position. He must have felt that he should be better in this position, and he is actually. Carlsen continues with the good old h-pawn. And here Nakamura just barrels on with a5. And I have to say, I was surprised at that. Seems to me a decent practical decision is simply to block that h-pawn. Now, you could say, well, this weakens the dark squares around the king. Well, maybe. But the alternative was to allow that pawn forward. You have to make a compromise. And It's really difficult to know which is best, but I think h3 is a good idea. Now, no doubt Carlsen would break out like this anyway. But this is different. Would he have done this? I don't know. This is different because now Black's king is weak. And I think this is a very different scenario to the game continuation. Feels like White is very much in the game there. So it's not absolutely clear to me what Carlsen would have done after h3. In any case, a5 was played and it's still pretty crazy. Carlsen played the pawn up, and this is a real randomizer. It's just chipping open the king, basically. Good idea. And if pawn takes pawn, you're going to break with d5 and try to get through to the king. So, for example, knight takes rook, pawn takes pawn, and potentially you're taking here. Really complicated. Nakamura went for rook a1, allowing that pawn to be taken on g2. So I love this because neither player has blinked. Nakamura punting the a-pawn, Carlsen punting the h-pawn. Now, whose strategy is going to come good here? Nakamura took on c7. I mean, he could keep going with this one. Take here, take here. I mean, I have no idea what is happening in this position. It's some kind of a blockade. But these two pawns look absolutely terrifying. Very strange position. But Nakamura took on c7. And then played b5. Bishop a8, preempting a pawn push. And, well, those pawns could be pushed again, but Nakamura went first rook b1. That looks like a hesitant move to me. Because now after d5, well, who knows what's really going on in this position. But in practical terms, I think this is now much easier for Black to play than White. Why? Well, let's look at the kings. White's king is breaking open. Black's king is actually very safe. So, you know, in a rapid play game, a random hit could easily hit White's king, but it's probably not going to hit Black's. So let's see. So this aim is just to bust open this diagonal, bust open this diagonal, and that one as well. So it's all going on. White has a lot to take care of now. b6, queen e5. Now, a6 is possible, but now it's time to give up a piece and just take on e4. So although Black is the exchange down, you can see because Black has broken through to the king, then actually that looks really promising for Black. So after queen e5, f4 played. And the queen came in. Is it dangerous for the queen? Not really. Actually, there are lots of loose pieces, and actually White can't really get a good hit on the queen. So once again, if a6, this can be taken. With the bishop on a8, actually, the a-pawn really isn't going anywhere. In the meantime, there's a lot going on the king side. That knight looks monstrous on e4. Queen c3 just played. Queen e1. Carlsen wants to keep the queen on the board. Bishop a4 and knight c5. And now a6. So that's taken. And b7. So finally, Nakamura does win some material with those pawns. But actually, I'm sure Carlsen was mightily relieved to see the back of those two pawns. And now he can concentrate on the other side of the board. And it's looking pretty messy. But messy when White's king is exposed, not Black's. Carlsen went for bishop c5. It's not the only good move in the position. Bishop b4 is also very good. Bishop c5. So obviously bishop takes, bishop, knight takes. Hits a few things and starts to come over here as well. Rook back, hits the queen. Queen takes. Bishop c5. Knight c5. Rook b4. And here Carlsen made a very pragmatic decision. I guess you could keep the queens on with queen d3, but he chose to keep it simple, and he was ahead on the clock. Nakamura was running shorter time, but actually the position is the problem here. So Carlsen has managed to simplify into an endgame where he's the exchange down, but he's about to pick off lots of pawns. I mean, Nakamura's short time, so he went down very quickly here. In fact, rook b5 is still a little bit tricky when white starts exchanging pawns. Black is definitely better. But anyway, rook d4 played, and now it really is hopeless. Nakamura just started giving away pawns, but this looks terrible now. And bishop d7. Well, did Nakamura have in mind a trick here? Was it all about this? If rook d8, this did not happen. Then bishop f5, and here, and rook a8. Maybe that's the issue. Maybe that's what Naka was going for. But of course, black does not need to play rook d8. Knight takes bishop, and now rook c2. So with all these pawns, this beautiful knight... oh, hang on. Octopus knight! Octopus knight alert. I've got the mug. Octopus knight, rook on 7th, and a whole stack of pawns. It is utterly lost for white. Well, that's trying to stop the e-pawn advancing. But now Carlsen just keeps everything nice and tight here. Black's pawns can't be touched. The king can't be attacked. I mean, basically, this is the perfect formation. Let's just see how it ended. Reminds me of a Roman legion. You know, how they managed to advance with sort of shields over their heads and tight formation, and basically, you know, you couldn't attack it, not properly. And here it's the same. Here Nakamura resigned, by the way. Let's just see what could happen. King g4. There you go. You just keep it absolutely tight, and basically black's pieces just roll forward. Nothing that white can do against that. So fantastic comeback win in game 2. So that meant it was 1-1. Next 2 games were drawn. Then they went to a tiebreak, and Carlsen crushed the tiebreak. 2 very easy wins. Nakamura completely collapsed, actually. So Carlsen goes through, and well, he seemed mightily relieved, and he did say by the end he felt he was getting into a rhythm. He also said that Nakamura, in his experience, Nakamura often tightens up if he's ahead in a match, and that seemed to happen here. Really entertaining game. Was it completely correct from Carlsen? Probably not. But, I mean, I know these positions, hedgehog positions, very well with black. I've played them on so many occasions. And these randomizing moves like b5, in practice, they're very, very difficult to meet, as we saw here. So in the next round, let me see who plays who. Carlsen plays Radjabov. That's tough. Radjabov is a very solid, rapid play player. That's going to be interesting. And Wesley So plays Jan Nepomniachtchi. All good stuff. All very interesting. Thanks very much for watching. More tomorrow.